We're now 23 minutes away from our anticipated acquisition of signal with Orion. Again, the vehicle continues to fly behind the moon. It is now 764 miles above the lunar surface, but at the time of closest approach will be 81 miles above the surface. Now, we do have the outbound powered flyby burn coming up in about 6 minutes and 40 seconds from now. But this maneuver was first done during Apollo 8 on Christmas Eve 54 years ago. Apollo 8 was the first crewed spacecraft to leave low Earth orbit and the first human spaceflight to reach the moon. The crew of Frank Borman, James Lovell, and Bill Anders orbited the moon 10 times without landing before splashing down on December 27, 1968. While Apollo 8 completed 10 orbits around the moon, about 60 miles above the surface, once Orion emerges from the far side of the moon, it will slingshot out to distant retrograde orbit about 30,000 miles away from the Earth. This orbit is critical for key tests and to evaluate how Orion performs in deep space, and this will be the furthest any human-rated spacecraft will have ever traveled away from Earth. But for now, let's take a quick look back on that historic Apollo 8 mission now.
Well, Apollo 8 originally was an Earth orbital mission exercising the lunar module. But the lunar module was way behind. The people in NASA came up with the idea of moving Apollo 8 to a lunar orbital mission.
Why don't we send the command service module of Apollo 8 to orbit the moon, and we can learn a lot about the communication system, the navigation system, how the moon's gravity would affect the orbiting spacecraft, look for suitable landing spots. Well, I got into the big Saturn V. This would be the first time that man had actually launched on a Saturn V. So I thought to myself, after this 4 months of heavy training, I said, you know, I'm actually going to go to the moon. We had orbited the Earth, first of all, to check our spacecraft out. Then, when everything was fine and the spacecraft looked fine to go to the moon, we lit the third stage for a second time.
Trajectory and guidance are go, over.
We can actually coast all the way to the moon.
And after a while, you could look back and see the Earth getting smaller and smaller. People on Earth tend to call the far side of the moon the dark side, but that's a misnomer. On our flight, the moon was between the Earth and the sun, and the far side was lit by the sun.
We saw the far side. You know, we're like three school kids looking into a candy store window, I guess, just staring at the unnamed craters as they slowly passed us by.
We were busy shooting pictures of the lunar surface for lunar landing sites for upcoming lunar landings. And then suddenly I looked out the window and here was this gorgeous orb coming up, and I thought, holy moly.
And there over the lunar landscape was the Earth. The Earth was beautiful. It was the only thing in the whole universe that had any color.
I had fought to have a long lens and color film. I didn't have a light meter, just banged off a dozen or so pictures, changing the f-stop each click.
I put my thumb up to the window of the spacecraft, and I could completely hide the Earth behind my thumb. The Earth is a mere speck in the Milky Way galaxy.
And from the crew of Apollo 8, we close with good night, good luck, a Merry Christmas, and God bless all of you on the good Earth.
If you're just joining us, Orion is currently behind the moon, and we are in a period of anticipated loss of signal as the moon blocks the signal of the Deep Space Network. We are looking ahead to the outbound powered flyby burn, which will take place with the orbital maneuvering system about 2 minutes from now at 6:44 a.m. Central. At this time, Orion is about 670 miles above the lunar surface. During its time of closest approach, Orion will be about 81 miles above the surface of the moon. We're now 1 minute and 45 seconds away from today's outbound powered flyby burn. This burn will last for 2 minutes and 30 seconds. This burn will occur with Orion's Orbital Maneuvering System, or OMS engine, which was successfully checked out on Tuesday following the liftoff of Orion aboard the Space Launch System from the Kennedy Space Center in Florida. The OMS engine performing spectacularly so far. While this is the first flight for the OMS engine as a part of the Artemis program, it actually flew on 19 space shuttle flights, beginning with STS-41G in October 1984 and ending with STS-112 in October 2002. We're now just 40 seconds away from the OMS engine getting to flex its firing capabilities on the backside of the moon. Less than 30 seconds until today's burn. "15 seconds until the burn begins. And we anticipate the outbound powered flyby burn to have begun. Again, because we are behind the backside of the moon, we do not have communications with the Orion spacecraft just yet, but we do anticipate acquiring that signal in 15 minutes and 50 seconds from now. At that time, we should be able to evaluate performance of the OPF burn and have some more information about how the burn went. 30 seconds into the burn, 2 minutes remaining in today's outbound powered flyby burn. One minute into the outbound powered flyby burn. This outbound powered flyby will send Orion close enough to the lunar surface to leverage the moon's gravitational force and swing the spacecraft once around the moon toward entry into that distant retrograde orbit. Orion will remain in the distant retrograde orbit for one long elliptical orbit around the moon, lasting about 6 days. This orbit is called distant due to the high altitude from the moon. It's about 40,000 miles past the moon in its orbit, which is actually 30,000 miles farther than the previous record set during Apollo 13, and will be the farthest in space any spacecraft built for humans will have ever flown. 30 seconds remaining in today's burn. Now, once in this distant retrograde orbit, the orbit is called retrograde because Orion will travel around the moon opposite the direction the moon travels around Earth. Distant retrograde orbit provides a highly stable orbit where little fuel is required to stay for an extended trip in deep space in order to put Orion's systems to the test in an environment far from Earth. And the outbound powered flyby burn should be complete. And we are less than 14 minutes away from our anticipated acquisition of our signal with Orion. The next milestone we'll look ahead towards in our coverage today is when Orion will complete its closest approach to the lunar surface. In 10 minutes from now, Orion will be flying 81 miles above the lunar surface. That closest approach occurring at 6:57 a.m. Central, 7:57 a.m. Eastern. Then just 2 minutes from the time of closest approach, we do anticipate our acquisition of signal. If you're just joining us, the Orion spacecraft is currently flying behind the moon. We are in a period of loss of signal due to the fact that the moon is blocking Orion's ability to communicate with the Deep Space Network, but we do anticipate gaining signal on the Deep Space Network in 11 minutes and 30 seconds from now. At 6:44 a.m. Central Time, Orion's orbital maneuvering system engine completed a 2-minute and 30-second burn. This burn is called the outbound powered flyby burn. Now again, because we are behind the moon, we will not be able to have data from the Orion spacecraft to evaluate how the burn performance was, but we do expect to learn a little bit more about that once we come back behind the moon. On this graphic you see on your screen, that is, of course, the Orion spacecraft. And the large engine that you see in the middle of the spacecraft there is the orbital maneuvering system. That was the engine that just performed the burn. We anticipate that burn to have lasted 2 minutes and 30 seconds. The OMS engine, or Orbital Maneuvering System engine, provides 6,000 pounds of thrust and can steer the spacecraft, and can be used in some abort cases to safely return Orion to Earth. And in this animation, you're also seeing some of the auxiliary engines on board Orion. These are also located on the bottom of the service module in 4 sets of 2. Each of these engines provides about 100 pounds of thrust. There are also 24 smaller engines grouped into 6 pods, which provide attitude control for Orion. They can be fired individually as needed to move the spacecraft in different directions and rotate it into different positions. So in total, the service module has 33 engines. But today's burn, again, we anticipate to have been... We anticipate the burn to have occurred with the Orbital Maneuvering System, or OMS engine. We are now 5 minutes away from Orion's closest approach to the lunar surface. As Orion continues to travel behind the moon, we are still in a period of anticipated loss of signal as the moon blocks the signal to the Deep Space Network. We are anticipating the acquisition of signal in less than 7 minutes from now. At 6:44 a.m. Central, just about 9 minutes and 30 seconds ago, commands were sent for the outbound powered flyby burn to occur with the Orbital Maneuvering System engine, or OMS engine, on board Orion, which sends Orion close enough to the lunar surface to leverage the moon's gravitational force and swing the spacecraft once around the moon toward entry into distant retrograde orbit. Following this, Orion will remain in the distant retrograde orbit for 1/2 elliptical orbit around the moon, which will last about 6 days. The orbit is called distant due to the high altitude from the moon, which is about 40,000 miles past the moon in its orbit. This will be 30,000 miles farther than the previous record set during Apollo 13, and will also be the farthest in space any spacecraft built for humans will have ever flown. The orbit is called retrograde because Orion will travel around the moon opposite the direction the moon travels around Earth. Distant retrograde orbit provides a highly stable orbit where little fuel is required to stay for an extended trip in deep space in order to put Orion's systems to the test in an environment far from Earth. Now, this orbit is different than the orbit done during the Apollo program, in which the spacecraft and its crew orbited much closer to the lunar surface in a more circular fashion. Distant retrograde orbit is important because it helps us to learn about how a spacecraft functions in a deep space environment. As part of the Artemis program, the Gateway program is building a small human-tended space station which will orbit the moon and provide extensive capabilities to support NASA's Artemis campaign. Gateway's capabilities for supporting sustained exploration and research in deep space include docking ports for a variety of visiting spacecraft, space for crew to live and work, and onboard science investigations to study heliophysics, human health, and life sciences, among other areas. We are expecting the acquisition of signal to occur in 4 minutes from now. At this time, we do expect Orion to be completing its closest approach to the lunar surface. Orion should be just about 81 miles above the surface of our closest celestial neighbor. At this time of closest approach, Orion flying at a lunar latitude of 6.5 degrees and a lunar longitude of 120 degrees. Orion is fairly close to the equator at this time. Now just 2 minutes away from our anticipated acquisition of signal. One minute and 30 seconds until the anticipated acquisition of signal. Again, Orion is currently flying behind the backside of the moon, having completed its closest approach at 6:57 a.m. Central, just 81 miles above the lunar surface. Less than 30 seconds until our anticipated acquisition of signal. The mood certainly a bit suspenseful here in Mission Control as we await Orion to emerge from the backside of the moon. We're standing by for acquisition of signal. And we do have confirmation of an acquisition of signal on the Deep Space Network in Goldstone. This view on your screen of planet Earth taken from Orion's Solar Array Wing Camera, or SAW camera. Standing on the shoulders of the giants of the Apollo generation, Orion now carries forward the torch of the Artemis generation as it emerges from behind the moon, an Earthrise of our pale blue dot and its 8 billion human inhabitants now coming into view. With the successful acquisition of signal from the Orion spacecraft, the team here in Mission Control, Houston, will evaluate the spacecraft systems to evaluate performance of the outbound powered flyby burn, which occurred 18 minutes and 50 seconds ago. And you're looking at this view on your screen from the Orion spacecraft as it looks back at planet Earth, having launched just 5 days ago. Orion is now over 230,000 miles away from Earth. Orion emerged from the backside of the moon just minutes ago after completing the outbound powered flyby burn. That burn occurring 21 minutes ago. While behind the moon, Orion completed its closest approach to the moon at a distance of 80 miles above the surface. And you're looking at a live view inside the Orion spacecraft. This is, of course, an uncrewed test flight, but we do have a couple of purposeful passengers that have hopped a ride on board Orion. You're looking at one there on the left of your screen. That is Moonikin wearing the Orion crew survival suit. This is the space suit that crew will wear during dynamic phases of flight once we do have a crew on board, particularly during launch and entry situations. The OX, or Orion Crew Survival Suit, can help keep astronauts alive if Orion were to lose cabin pressure during the journey out to the moon. The OX is equipped to up to 6 days of life support systems as the crew makes their way back to Earth. And as part of this uncrewed test flight, there's a variety of sensors and data that will be pulled from the Orion Crew Survival Suit to inform further design ahead of crewed flight test as part of Artemis 2. And this view of our home planet, taken from 229,000 miles away from the Orion spacecraft, following its outbound powered flyby burn behind the moon. At its closest approach, Orion flew 81 miles above the lunar surface. We're now 5 days, 6 hours, and 27 minutes into the historic flight of Artemis 1. The Orion spacecraft just recently emerged from the backside of the moon after completing the outbound powered flyby. Coming up at MET 5 days, 6 hours, and 52 minutes, which is about 54 minutes after the OPF burnout, Orion is slated to fly extremely close to the Apollo 11 landing site. The Apollo 11 landing site, named Tranquility Base, was where Commander Neil Armstrong and lunar module pilot Buzz Aldrin touched down on July 20th, 1969, 53 years ago. As Orion continues to swing around the moon toward entry into distant retrograde orbit, we were just getting some views of the Earth from about 220,000 miles away. We do expect to get those views again here momentarily, but you are looking at a live view inside Mission Control Houston, where NASA Flight Director Judd Freeling is leading the team on console. 33 minutes ago, Orion completed the outbound powered flyby burn, which lasted 2 minutes and 30 seconds, which sent Orion close enough to the lunar surface to leverage the moon's gravitational force and swing the spacecraft around the moon toward entry into distant retrograde orbit. Next up for Orion will be insertion into distant retrograde orbit, where it will remain for 1/2 long elliptical orbit around the moon. This period will last about days. Following this, Orion will complete a similar maneuver in which it flies behind the moon in a return power flyby. And as you might expect, just the opposite of the outbound powered flyby. This maneuver will help put Orion on a trajectory to return back to Earth and splash down in the Pacific Ocean on December 11th. And another view of the flight director on console today during today's operations, Rick LeBrode. And coming into your view on your screen right there in the red jacket is the Johnson Space Center Center Director, Vanessa Weish. And if you're just joining us, Orion has emerged from the backside of the moon after completing the outbound powered flyby 42 minutes ago. This burn lasted 2 minutes and 30 seconds and sent Orion close enough to the lunar surface to leverage the moon's gravitational force and swing the spacecraft once around the moon toward entry into distant retrograde orbit. Once inserted in the distant retrograde orbit, Orion will remain in the distant retrograde orbit for 1/2 elliptical orbit around the moon. This will last about 6 days. We're just 6 minutes away from the anticipated flyover of the Apollo 11 landing site, Tranquility Base. We anticipate that flyover to occur at 7:37 a.m. Central. During the flyover, Orion will be 1,384 statute miles above the landing site. And you are looking at a live view inside Mission Control Houston, where NASA Flight Director Rick LeBrode is on console, leading the team here in Mission Control following the outbound powered flyby burn, which occurred 49 minutes ago. This 2-minute and 30-second burn utilized the Orbital Maneuvering System, or OMS, engine on board the Orion spacecraft, and help set the stage for descent retrograde insertion. We're now 2 minutes away from the anticipated flyover of the Apollo 11 landing site, Tranquility Base. Orion will be 1,384 statute miles above the landing site. And at this time, we do expect Orion to be flying over the Apollo 11 landing site at Tranquility Base. Orion is 1,384 statute miles above the landing site. Tranquility Base was where Commander Neil Armstrong and lunar module pilot Buzz Aldrin landed on the moon for the very first time on July 20th, 1969, 53 years ago. And with the outbound powered flyby burn now complete, and Orion having completed its closest approach to the moon at a distance of 80 miles above the surface, that will wrap up our coverage for today, but we'll continue to post daily updates about the mission on the Artemis blog at blogs.nasa.gov/Artemis. And we'll also be posting updates on our social media accounts as well. Later today, we'll have a briefing at 4 p.m. Central, 5 p.m. Eastern, where representatives from NASA will discuss the outbound powered flyby, which we hope you'll tune in for. And we'll be live on NASA TV covering the distant retrograde orbit insertion Friday beginning at 3:30 p.m. Central, 4:30 p.m. Eastern Time. Until then, this is Mission Control Houston.